Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about the frame rates I use when shooting stuff like this. Okay, hello and welcome back. If you are new here, if this is your first time, my name is Greg. I'm a motorsports videographer based in St. Louis, Missouri, and I travel the world shooting race cars. I have shot everything from F1 to IMSA to World Endurance Championship and even IndyCar. And today I'm going to cover the different frame rates that I used all throughout 2025 and the situations that I think are best to use them in. And that includes everything from the super fast 24 frame stuff to the slow motion 120 stuff that everybody loves. And I'll even explain how I do the ultra slow motion stuff. I'm going to run through different shooting situations that I would use when I'm filming trackside or if I'm filming static car shoots and even hero shots, and explain why I use what I use. Okay, some basic housekeeping, especially if you don't know much about this stuff. You're going to hear me use the word FPS a lot, and what that means is frames per second, and the very non-technical explanation for that would be the number of pictures your camera is taking per second of video taken. The basic sort of cinema industry standard would be 24 of those pictures per second. That's the most natural looking image when you're playing back at 100% speed. And then of course, the higher that number goes, the more pictures it's taking per second and the more you're able to slow that footage down in post. You're also going to hear me talk about the 180-degree shutter rule. And all that means is if you are recording in something like 24 frames per second, the shutter angle you would use on your camera would be 1/48 or 1/50. And if you're recording in say 120 frames per second, you would want to have your shutter at 1/250. Basically just to say you want your shutter to always be as close to double your frame rate as you can. And the reason for that is it produces the most realistic motion blur at that camera's base frame rate. But we'll get more into what that actually means for the image in just a minute. In 2025, I pretty exclusively used 24 and 120 frames per second only. I find that these two frame rates cover most of what I need to do. I will occasionally use 60 frames per second, and I'll explain those situations in just a minute. But definitely when I'm shooting cars on trackside, I'm only using 24 frames or 120 frames. 90% of the time I'm shooting in 24 frames per second. When I'm trackside, this is the frame rate that I use when I really want to show the speed of the cars. When I use that with the 180-degree shutter rule, I'm getting loads of realistic motion blur, and it makes these cars look like they're going a million miles an hour. Now, the idea of motion blur can get a little bit tricky or confusing to some people, especially when you're talking about using it with the 180-degree shutter rule, because that rule is supposed to provide a realistic level of motion blur to the footage that you're recording in whatever frame rate that is. But what you need to understand is that that's only providing a realistic motion blur for that sort of base level of speed. Okay, so what does that actually mean when you're shooting in the field? This is a clip that was shot in 24 frames per second with 1/48 shutter. You can see as I pan the camera, we get loads of motion blur and the image feels super fast. Now, this is the same shot from the same spot, but now I'm recording in 120 frames per second with a 1/250 shutter. As you can see, when I'm playing it back at 100% speed, the image isn't nearly as smooth. First of all, it's a little bit more jittery, but more importantly, it has significantly less motion blur than it does in the 24 frame per second clip. Now, the reason for that is that 180-degree shutter rule, when you're recording at 120 frames per second, is only applying a level of motion blur that would be realistic when that clip is slowed down all the way. You can see now that it's slowed down, the clip is actually extremely smooth as compared to when it was played back at 100% speed. So when I know that I'm going to play something back at 100% speed, I'm always shooting in 24 frames per second so that I get nice, smooth image and definitely a lot of realistic motion blur. So the question then is, what scenarios would I shoot 120 frames in? And the basic answer for me to that is I'm shooting 120 frames with intention, meaning when I want to show the details of the car on track, like going over the bumps at Sebring, or if I want to emphasize something epic like a golden hour pit stop, I'll shove the camera down in that 120 frames per second, and it helps me create a more dramatic, sort of cinematic looking image. So the basic answer, especially when you're shooting cars on track, is if you know that you're going to play it back at 100% speed, you should be shooting in 24 frames per second. If you have something where you really want to show some detail, or if you know that you want to slow it down in post, that's when you choose 120. Now, it's worth mentioning that generally speaking, when you're recording in that 24 frames per second, you're getting the full sensor readout of the camera. But when you put it in 120, there's generally, in most consumer grade cameras, there's going to be a little bit of a crop. So sort of another sort of positive in the 24 frame per second column is that you're never going to get much crop when you're shooting in that frame rate. So you're getting the absolute maximum quality possible. So what frame rate am I using when I'm shooting the absolute ultra slow motion shots? Well, I'm actually still using 120 frames per second here, but I'm able to use DaVinci's AI Speed Warper to slow this image down to 1%. It's not amazing. You can't have an image with a lot of motion in it. So I try to pick frames where I'm not moving the camera massive amounts. If I'm imagining I'm shooting 1,000 frames per second, the 180-degree shutter rule would dictate that I would use a 1/2000. This helps get rid of any motion blur whatsoever, because when you do slow that footage down to that 1%, you don't want any motion blur, and that helps the speed warper fill in those gaps in between each frame. Okay, that's how I handle all of the on-track stuff. Now, what about some of the other scenarios? For talking head interviews, I'm always using 24 frames per second. It's easier on the camera. It gives you that extra bit of quality because it's reading out the whole sensor, and it gives you that sort of buttery smooth cinematic look. It's not a big problem on the cameras that I use, but 24 frames is also a little bit easier on your camera. So if you're shooting a very long interview, it would help keep your camera from overheating. Now, when I'm shooting static car shots, which is to say when the cars are just sitting still and they're not moving, that's when I break out that 60 frames per second. Because those cars aren't moving, I'm not overly concerned about the motion blur in the image. I'm generally walking pretty slow and the cars aren't moving, so there's not any blur whatsoever. And I shoot it in 60 frames so that there's certain scenarios where I might want to slow that picture down just a little bit, and that 60 FPS helps me slow that down to 40%, which is usually more than enough for what I need. Now, why 60 and not 120? Again, it's a little easier on the camera, so it doesn't get quite as hot, and then also it's not quite as much of a sensor crop as it is at 120, so there's a little bit of a quality bump in there as well. I use that same 60 FPS when I'm shooting a lot of my driver hero shots, and while they do move a little bit throughout these shots, it's not fast enough that you would be generating a lot of motion blur, so you don't really pick up that jittery feel that would need me to sort of use that 24 FPS. Now, for all of my rolling car-to-car shots, when we're doing shots of the cars with a chase car, I'm always shooting those at 24 frames per second. For all the reasons I mentioned previously, it just gives a very smooth image, lots of motion blur. It makes the cars feel like they're going that little bit faster, and it just creates that smooth cinematic image. Like I said before, if it's moving and you're going to play it back at 100% speed, 24 frames per second. Just no reason to do anything else. Lastly, my action cameras. I have a whole video about camera settings that you can go check out on everything that I use for those, but in terms of frame rates, same thing. I'm always using 24 frames per second, especially with action cameras when you want to feel that camera shake and you want to feel like the car, the hard mount piece is going really fast. You have to be shooting with a lot of motion blur, and that 24 FPS with a 1/50 shutter is exactly what you need for something like that. I actually don't think I've ever used the slow-mo option on any of my action cameras. The last thing I'll say is in regards to what I would call sort of specialty camera shots. Occasionally I will be shooting some slow shutter dragging shots. Those are where I keep the camera in that 24 frame per second, but I break that 180-degree shutter rule and drag the shutter all the way down to 1/8 or 1/10 or 1/15. Shots like this are great for breaking up an edit, adding something a little bit more styled. I also shoot a lot of like little transition pieces with them, whether I'm shooting sort of panning through lights on the car or panning through different parts of the driver's suits and things like that. Something that can help spice up your edits and transition you from shot to shot. That's pretty much it. That's overly simple, I'm sure, but definitely something that is important when you're trying to capture good quality video. I think the first year that I ever started, I was shooting everything at 120 frames per second because I didn't know what I wanted to slow down and what I didn't. And as I've sort of progressed throughout my filmmaking career, I have almost done the opposite. I shoot everything in 24 frames per second now and just pray that I don't have to slow it down, because I would rather have that smooth sort of high motion blur image, especially with things like action sports and racing, than I would rather have a clip that I wish I could slow down later. But like I said at the beginning, I think the biggest thing right now for me is I'm trying to be intentional. I'm trying to think about the shots that I want and not just sort of give myself maximum flexibility for the future. I'm shooting with intention, I'm shooting with a plan, and I think that's really helped sort of bring my images a little bit more to life. That's gonna be it for this one. I would like to do more sort of tutorial type content like this, where I break down different things like camera settings and stuff like that. So I'm gonna defer to you guys on that. Let me know what topic you'd like to see next and I'll get that covered. I enjoy doing stuff like this. So we're gonna have things like editing breakdowns and camera walkthroughs later. So if you're into that kind of stuff, hit the subscribe button. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button. As they say, that helps out quite a lot. I appreciate you guys, and we'll see you in the next one.